Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to this important conference, but particularly for our first session entitled A World of Less Trade and the Future Pattern of the Global Economy. First, on behalf of the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee, let me congratulate the Central Bank of Albania for her anniversary, but also we are very pleased to participate and to cause this conference. And I want to thank the governor, but also all the staff for making this conference a great success. And I think we have in front of us a very good agenda that will bring us to the discussion about the prospect of the global economy, fragmentation, the future of capital flow. And during the course of the day, of course, we'll be looking at the monetary policy challenges, issue of stable coins, the rise of stable coins, and future of Europe. So let me first try to set the stage. You know, we have been talking about 100 years anniversary of the central bank, looking at the past. I think this session is going to be looking at the forward-looking for the global economy, and we have an outstanding panel in order to do this. Let me briefly introduce them. All the bio and CV are on the website, and after I will give the floor to our panelists. So we have with us Riccardo Ercoli, the Executive Director for Albania at the IMF, representing not only Albania, but Italy, Portugal, and other countries. And Riccardo will be speaking here on his personal capacity, not representing the board or the IMF. Gian Maria Milesi Ferretti, a very good friend, but also a senior fellow at the Asian Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution, one of the leading think tanks in Washington. Piroshka Nagi-Moazi, visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Piroshka, welcome. And I know you have been coming to Tirana different times, and I think the LSE was also causing a couple of events here with the central bank. Gabriel Felbermeyer, the professor and director of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, who is here with us and will give us a lot of interesting insight about what's happening in Europe, and do we see here maybe in a world of fragmentation a need to think more about more regional integration. Last but not least, another part of the world, because here this conference is not about only the Balkan countries and small open economies, and I think we wanted to do it very global. So we are very pleased to welcome also Natia Tornava, the governor of the National Bank of Georgia, who is with us. Governor, thank you very much for being with us also, and we have a chance also to cooperate together last May for an important conference. So the way we're going to conduct the seminar, and this session particularly, will be to ask each of our speakers here to make a first introductory statement, clearly looking at the prospect of the global economy. You know, Governor and the Prime Minister talk about already great transformation, resilience. I think we are really in a world of a major change happening in the global economy, but something that was not on the mindset of central bankers: strategic autonomy, economic security, reconfiguration of supply chain. So all of these things, tariff, this is also a thing that was not the case when we were talking about global economic integrations. So we are going to start, if I may, with Gian Maria Milesi Ferretti, who are going to give us and set the stage. Gian Maria co-authored a very important study that was released by the CPR on fragmentation, that was released, I think, 2 weeks ago, with some of you co-authors. So Gian Maria, Reshaping the Global Economy, the Future Pattern of Trade. We are working in a world of tariff, future of capital flow, setting the stage for us. And after we move on to Piroshka, we'll try to look at different angles. Over to you, Gian Maria, and thank you very much for being with us for this important event.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a real honor to be here. It's my first time in Tirana. Government SECO, thanks for the kind hospitality, for the invitation to join this conference. I will base my remarks on the gist of our report on geopolitical tensions and financial fragmentation that Mark just mentioned, have co-authors from the Fed, from the ECB, and from academia that join me in that endeavor. I would say, in general, making economic forecasts is already more art than science and very difficult. Doing so in an environment where the geopolitical configuration of the world is in flux is even more challenging. So I think we need a hefty dose of humility in looking forward, I think uncertainty, we always say uncertainty is high, but if there is a moment where this is particularly true, it is now. Let me start by pointing out where we are in the structure of international financial connections. And as I've mentioned in previous panels of this type, the financial system is different from trade and GDP in that it is still dominated by advanced economies. Trade has a large representation of emerging economies, of course China in primis, but in global finance and asset allocation, advanced economies are still very dominant. This implies that it is hard to think, clearly we can see signs of fragmentation of flows being more resilient between countries that share a similar geopolitical view. But in terms of aggregate importance, the emerging economies are still more marginal than they are in the world of trade. How have these linkages, though, changed since geopolitical tensions have risen? Fundamentally, they have deepened across advanced economies, particularly vis-à-vis the US, but also within advanced economies more generally. What have we seen in terms of signs of fragmentation? Well, if you look at aggregate data on cross-border flows, on cross-border portfolio holdings, you don't see globalization in retreat. The levels move slowly, but we have not really seen a decline in cross-border holdings. What we have seen, though, are signs of changing linkages depending on geopolitical preferences. I think, of course, the most extreme case is Russia, and there you have a very clear evidence of what the implications of fragmentation can be when you have geopolitical tensions and sanctions causing a massive change in the structure of financial linkages and portfolios. But even abstracting from that case, considering also that the weight of Russia in international trade and finance is still in absolute terms relatively modest, you see large changes in the way China is interacting financially with the rest of the world. So for a protracted period of time, the asset side of China's balance sheet was primarily in foreign exchange reserves, in US treasuries, but not just treasuries, other financial instruments issued by the United States. But in the last 15 years or so, there has been a continuous process of portfolio diversification by China away from the United States. And I think there is a quite striking statistic. If you look at bilateral trade, you see massive surpluses of China vis-à-vis the United States over the past decade. If you look at finance, you see zero net accumulation of claims on the United States by China. And China, in contrast, has been increasing its footprint in other emerging economies through FDI, through lending, in a way, though, that it is much harder to track than for any advanced economy. And the reason is that China goes primarily through financial centers to reach the final destination of its investment. That is through Hong Kong, but it is through the Cayman Islands, through the British Virgin Islands. So while we have a pretty good sense of the overall trend towards diversification, we have a much less precise sense of individual holdings and exposures, given the opacity of the structure of holdings and this passage through financial centers. Where do we think this fragmentation can have more significant consequences? I would say on foreign direct investment, because foreign direct investment is more directly tied to the global allocation of production, control of scarce resources. It is a different set of considerations to those that pertain to standard portfolio diversification through sort of diversifying risk, holding bonds issued by different countries. You can have much more meaningful consequences of fragmentation on that front, the restructuring and increased resilience of supply chains being one aspect of this. Again, getting a good data sense of this is very complex, but there are clear signs that we're moving in a direction where FDI is becoming more fragmented across geopolitical lines. On currencies, there are clearly huge efforts by countries, particularly in the emerging world, to reduce their dependence on Western payment systems, say on reliance on US-based institutions and the dollar more generally. China through the CIPS and other countries more directly sanctioned, think of Russia or Iran, that try to establish their own payment systems. I think it is an area that macroeconomists have not paid enough attention to. Much more attention is devoted to it now. I'm sure we're going to hear more about this as we go further. Last point I want to make is on implications for those economies that are not as large as those I have mentioned so far. There is clearly an undercurrent of regionalization, particularly for countries like Albania. For this region, you have very natural trade and financial ties to the euro area or to the EU, large player in international finance, and that is a very natural consequence of gravity forces and integration forces going above and beyond geopolitical considerations. But I think it is, in that sense, an easier position to be in compared to other emerging economies that are in a situation where it is really more difficult to pin down allegiances. They may have strong trade dependence on China, while sort of closer, maybe political ties with the United States. The concerns for countries that are less well anchored is that the international financial architecture doesn't benefit, to put it mildly, from geopolitical tensions. Reaching consensus in key multilateral institutions, such as the one I worked with for 28 years, the IMF, is, shall we say, daunting in an environment where you have increased tensions within the advanced economies, in addition to the geopolitical lines that that were more traditional, say, a year and a half ago. So let me leave it at this, and happy to come back to these issues further down in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Gian-Maria. So we don't see globalization in retreat. Piroshka, if I can turn to you and maybe to tell us what we see today, maybe, is the resilience of emerging markets. So, and even the IMF devoted a full chapter in the last World Economic Outlook on that resilience. Can you explain to us what are the sources of that resilience? And maybe does this country realize in the wall of fragmentation that they have no choice but to take their own future and their own destiny in their own hands? Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. It is a huge pleasure and honor to be here in Tirana. I first came here actually 36 years ago, and then in different capacity, I'm just really thrilled to be back to this important birthday celebration. I have actually, I think I'm the only one who has a PowerPoint presentation on this panel, and there is really one reason why I wanted to make a PowerPoint on an otherwise conversational discussion, and then that's if I manage to I think I might need some technical assistance. Oh, can you just enlarge my slide? Okay, and allow me to check. And this is the picture. I wanted to say, Gezuar d'Italien, happy birthday to the Bank of Albania on this important anniversary. I think it's a cause for celebration for so many reasons that we heard from the Prime Minister, from the Governor itself. So I have just a few remarks, but maybe I will give up on this. Huh? So backwards is forward. Well, that's, that's a lesson. So I think it's important to consider, given all the concerns that we have about rising geopolitical risks, the governor mentioned it as a major, number one challenge for his work. It's important to realize that we are in a global big transition, but not to be frightened by it. This region, and Albania in particular, is very much accustomed to the notion of transition. If we think where we were back in 1991, when Albania wasn't even a member of any international institution, just was opening up, very eager to join the family of the rest of the world. From there, you've progressed, you made tremendous progress, and yes, there are challenges, it's painful, but you know how to do transition. You know how to focus on the end point. In this case, of course, this is, as the governor said, this EU accession. It's very important. So that's a little bit easier than in this global transition. But I think some of the sources of resilience that you've shown during this transition from central planning to market will be very useful in the transition that you are facing now. Now, in that context, I would have 4 key messages for your consideration. Number 1 is the undoing of the old multilateral system that Gianmaria has now well described. Is actually started well before the US administration. So we can blame a lot on the current US government. I'm living in Washington now, so having the associated news shocks on not a daily, but on a moments-to-moments basis. But it started before, as Gianmaria has described already. And what I will mention to you is that there are some positive fallouts for the world. So let's take a positive look at that. The second one is that, as Mark already mentioned, whatever shock comes from this geopolitical transition, emerging markets are remarkably resilient, has proven market resilience, and research, notably from the IMF, my own little research, confirms this and gives some confidence for the future. Number 3, that in this new transition context, emerging markets can develop an optimal strategy, but that will, in my view, depend very much on their position in the global finance and trade networks, also Gianmaria mentioned that, and shared values. And number 4, that, and I think it will be coming perhaps a little bit of a surprise to you, but Albania and Southern Europe as a region is pretty well positioned to make their optimal strategy a reality. It just has to be a little push and realization in the right political corners. So which are the policies which I think in the US, which actually is not that bad for the rest of the world? It really has focused minds to face up and do long overdue domestic reforms. This is really a wake-up call. It's not a nice shock, but it's an opportunity. Number one is the clear focus now on internal market developments of bigger economies. Is the EU, the European Department, is here, has been focusing very much on the importance and the benefits from deepening the EU market, but beyond that, discussions in Canada, in India, on how to reduce internal barriers has really resurfaced now with a vengeance, and I think that's for the good of them and for the rest of the world. There is an accelerated defense spending in Europe. It is a huge development opportunity. Europe has a twin problem, right? Very low productivity, lagging behind the US, and lack of defense capabilities in the face of a threat from Russia. The two can be linked, and to do this, it is high-tech innovation, particularly from the defense sector, that can provide an engine of new growth. It's not very elegant, I know. We don't like military spending to be the driver of economic growth, but this is a reality in the European scene. And digital innovation actually can come from the military sector, defense sector, as we know from elsewhere. There are some good examples. There is a risk of wasting it if you spend it on, not on high-tech, but on other defense expenditures and bridges and what have you. Don't waste it. This is a unique opportunity for you. Germany has been forced finally to loosen its constitutionally enshrined debt brake that constrained the fiscal policy and stimulus that it needs to come from that country. And finally, the US policy of weak US dollar actually helps that repayment for emerging markets. So there is some silver lining. That's point number one. Point number two, and the main message, is that emerging markets are indeed incomparably more resilient than before. Emerging markets were tested already during the global financial crisis, and that was a tough one. Many of you participated on the receiving end and finding the solutions for that. But the COVID response really showed that emerging markets have come a long way to deal with huge shocks, external shocks. What are the reasons for this, as Mark posed the question to me? And I think the best and most updated answer is from the IMF's recent World Economic Outlook Chapter 2, compulsory reading for everybody. It's a very nice chapter, which finally recognized, which other researchers, including myself, my co-authors, have been pressing to say, that actually the main reason is that institutional frameworks, policy frameworks, have remarkably improved in emerging markets, domestic policy frameworks. It's about inflation targeting, which have much better anchored inflation expectations, more flexible exchange rate policy, as the governor mentioned in his welcoming speech, but also better fiscal frameworks. And altogether, it has allowed for counter-cyclical macro policies in the face of shocks, and that's a novelty. Counter-cyclical policies which did not end up with thin veneers of payments and fiscal crisis as in the past. My own little research in this area on central bank policy dealing with the COVID crisis induced inflation actually shows even more that in terms of reacting to the inflationary pressures post-COVID, emerging market central banks outperformed the Fed and the ECB in rising to the and addressing to the inflationary pressures in a much more timely manner than the Fed and the ECB and some other advanced country central banks. So great policy frameworks, number one. And the IMF colleagues identified also good luck, which I'm not sure that I would put too much currency on, excuse the pun. But I think what the second most important thing is that finally the three globally systemic central banks, the Federal Reserve of the US, the European Central Bank, and the People's Bank of China, acted during COVID as a real systemic central bank and provided on a much more consistent and predictable basis foreign exchange swaps and repos. This was absolutely critical to manage the stress periods at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and the very fact that these were there, and some of it is still standing, has helped emerging market central banks to manage liquidity shocks. So it's not only good policies domestically, although that's the critical role, but the safety that central bank arrangements on FX swap lines provided. Now, in this context, and I'm building here on what Gian Maria so eloquently described already in his and co-author's report, and now here, what could be an optimal strategy for emerging markets? I'm going to ask this gentleman who is doing operation to move away from the slides, because that's what I'm commenting on. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So drawing on the work, on the seminar work really of Helen Ray on trade and financial networks, which she's been developing. I think it's actually Nobel Prize worthy, so let's hope at some point, it will be recognized as such. We can say that we are already in a multipolar world. In terms of financial networks, the world has relied obviously on the US dollar, but also on the euro as the node point, the center of financial and payments systems. In terms of trade, as Gian Maria already mentioned, emerging markets play a more important role, and particularly China is the leader. China is very weak, although it's diversified, as we heard, but still very, very weak in its position as a leader in financial centers. So we have the financial centers, the US, a little bit of Europe, and then the trade networks, where China is the lead. And these are really creating blocks, three overlapping, for the simplicity of the argument, three overlapping financial and trade blocks. The US dollar, the euro, and the Chinese renminbi. Now, that will be, I think, the future. So it's not multipolar in a sense. It will be a three-polar system. China will probably adjust, and the euro, hopefully, through further improvement, will become, through the global euro project, a real global currency. And really the key optimal strategy is for countries to identify which is your primary, partner in this tripartite world, which is your most important trade partner and finance partner, and then formalize your relationship with that partner. So put down your currency, so to speak, so your token, and finalize, most importantly, FX swap and repo liquidity lines with the Fed, if you can. That's a little bit of a risk here, but with the ECB, and then we are coming to this region, or the People's Bank of China. Of course, the conditions of this currently of this swap price are different, but perhaps the world will move a little bit further with some IMF help. And finally, in this new optimal strategy for the global transition, when you have to put your policy focus toward your main finance and trade partner, actually the southern European region is very lucky, because you are already linked up to your most important trade and finance network center. You are already an EU candidate. Hopefully the chapters will be closing fast enough, but it's the journey becoming, the commitment to become the member on both sides, yourselves and the EU, which really matters. This is when most of the reforms happen anyway. It's also important, in my view, and based on the experience of EU candidate countries before you, to link EU membership, the process to the euro adoption from the very start. Today, from Central Europe, only those countries which linked EU membership with the commitment of euro adoption from the very beginning are the ones who are already in the eurozone, which, in my view, are much preferred to maintaining the much more costly and often abused monetary policy sovereignty in today's world. So EU membership should be going hand in hand with the commitment to adopt the euro. Countries which haven't followed for various reasons that path, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, my original country, Romania, are still outside. And there is vested interest around staying outside, which is serious, even though the recognition that the costs of being outside are very significant and outweigh the benefits. So the benefits are much more important than before. So link EU membership with euro adoption. When I talk to my Ukrainian friends, I keep telling them, and I hope that much more important people from institutions that really count, the IMF, the Commission, also recognize that important winning commitment. And in this context, for this region, you already have benefited, most of the countries, from ECB swaps and the repos. This could be really formalized. It has a standing arrangement with more transparency on the criteria that's still missing. It shouldn't be, if you're concerned about geopolitical reasons, the region is already a member of the EU, the European family. And you can look at it of an accelerated integration, euro adoption, not circumventing or leapfrogging the criteria, but making arrangement that makes life much easier through swap operations would be very helpful. And perhaps IMF colleagues could help in this regard. And I stop there.
Thank you, Piroshka. Let me now turn to Gabriel. Gabriel, Piroshka mentioned EU enlargement. So my question to you will be, in this world that we are seeing, fragmentation, economic security, the change of global value chain, where we are not talking anymore about just in time, but more about just in case, do you see now a case that the way the global economy will operate will be through more regional blocks? Please, over to you.
A very good morning to everyone. Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here. This is a great occasion. Thank you for that. Let me congratulate you also on the centennial. Let me also congratulate you at the bank for very good macro data. I've looked at Albanian figures and they look very good. I come from Austria. Our numbers are not in good shape, so congratulations on this. And then, because Mark mentioned accession to the European Union, I really wish that the EU speeds up the process of integrating Western Balkan countries, in particular Albania, into the European Union. I think that is to mutual advantage. The empirical evidence that shows the benefit of regional integration is clear, very clear. There's no doubt that this is an engine of progress, of economic progress for all parties involved in this. So I know that resistance in my own country, in many other places in Europe is there, but we need to work together to overcome that. Now, Mark asks whether in this world of re-emerging geopolitics and geoeconomics, where interdependencies are always risked of being weaponized, whether in such a world regional integration is the way forward, and they say absolutely yes. This is second best, of course. No? So we'd rather live in a world where we don't have to go towards regional integration because we have a global model that works. But I think it is obvious, and not just starting April 2nd, but this goes back now, I think, to the period around the great global financial crisis, 2008-2009, that the multilateral system is in a deep crisis. And what we have learned over the first 6 months or so of the new US presidency is that multilateralism, as we know it, for example, Article 1 of the GATT, Article 2 of the GATT, Article 3 of the GATT, Article 24 of the GATT, they are no longer really holding up. And in such a situation where the insurance against being discriminated or exploited by big powers is gone, one has to look for the second best, and the second best is to form coalitions wherever that is possible. I grew up in a world as a trade economist where we would say small is beautiful, because in this open multilateral system, a small country has the same chances and the same opportunities than the big one. But in a world of geoeconomics, where dependencies can be weaponized, small is no longer beautiful. And we're back in a situation where being together matters, to build up defenses against those attempts of coercion by building internal markets. I think this is crucial that in Europe we make our homework. The homework consists in deepening our common market by integrating countries that will be members of the European Union as soon as possible into that common market, even if political membership is maybe a little bit farther away, but integrating as fast as possible, as deep as possible into the common market is an insurance against those external shocks. Investing in infrastructure, because the single market is not just about rules, it's also about the physical infrastructure of making transactions possible. I think we have seen that very clearly in the energy crisis in Europe, that the lack of transport infrastructure for gas or for electricity hampers the market's integration. So I think the financial institutions need to do their job as well in financing the buildup of infrastructure. And here, this region can do with a lot more investment that Europe can fund, because we have excess savings in Europe. We should invest them not in the United States, I would say, or far away, but we should make use of these excess savings in our neighborhood, for example, in the Western Balkans. But the regional integration, of course, has downsides as well. This is the second best policy. And if we go into the history of international trade, often periods of regional integration coincided with geopolitical fragmentation, and we see this too. We see that blocks of currencies or trade blocks become politically relevant also in situations of conflict, and that is to be avoided, I think. So that this reconfiguration of the world economy into regional entities, or entities that are more strongly linked regionally, does not lead into more political distance, because that in the history has been fraught with further conflict and with the danger that we should avoid. Now, if we look at the data, there's one thing I think that has been mentioned by all speakers here, is that despite all this, the rise of protectionism, weaponization of interdependence, all these unpleasant things, if we look at the world economy and look at the aggregate figures, one can only be surprised by the stability that we see, even in trade. Now, if you look at the trade flows, they are volatile, but there is no such thing as a collapse of the global trade system. But trade is no longer growing faster than industrial production, it's no longer growing faster than GDP, and so for the world in total, trade is not an engine of growth anymore, because we do not see across the board deeper integration. That's the aggregate picture, but below the aggregate picture, we see a lot of shiftings, a lot of shifts. So the deceleration of globalization has been driven by China, mostly, whose trade openness after 2008 went down a lot. For the last years, it's the decoupling of the US with China and of Europe with Russia that drives the numbers. And so below this stability, there's still a lot of opportunities. And we can count the number of countries that over the last 5 years have become more open, and that number is much bigger than the number of countries that have reduced their openness. So not only in the regional level, but overall, there is still a lot of opportunity. And when we look at the Trump tariffs now, the April 2nd tariff wave, for example, because tariffs are different for different countries, there is also a lot of arbitrage to be done. Now, if I understand it correctly, Albania has a 10% blanket tariff, the EU has 15, Switzerland has 39, and this is just citing 3 examples, and this variation creates opportunities. Trade economists talk about trade diversion. So with a lot of variance, there's also always a chance of generating opportunities. And so I would say, yes, we see this integration into blocks. Yes, the aggregate picture is relatively stable. And yes, there's still opportunities, in particular for this region here. I agree with what Piavaška said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Let me now turn to Governor. Governor, you are part of a world that has been on the news recently, Central Asia and the Caucasus. We saw an important meeting of head of state in Washington. We have been seeing the European Union being much closer to Central Asia and Caucasus with Project Gateway. We're seeing the Belt and Road Initiative. So, in a sense, all of this, does it make a sense that in your part of your world, you see more a call for enhancing regional integration? We see that infrastructure is critical. There is a lot of discussion related to transportation, middle corridor connectivity. So tell us, in this transformation of the global economy, how your part of the world is positioning itself. Over to you.
So hello, everyone. First of all, of course, I would like to start with the expression of our gratitude and congratulations on behalf of National Bank of Georgia towards Central Bank of Albania. So we wish you success We wish you prosperity, at least for the next 100 years, and then probably we will celebrate in the future another achievement. And also, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to speak in front of you on such a topical issues. Yes, Georgia represents a classical example of small open economy, very much exposed to whatever happens globally around us, be it fragmentation, uncertainty, volatility of commodity markets, geopolitical tensions, trade tensions, military conflicts. Yes, we're very much exposed to those risks, but at the same time, I would like to speak about opportunities that have been mentioned here by other speakers, especially by Piroshka. If you open your presentation, I could easily follow the major topics that you highlighted there, because, and the statistics and the studies envisage that small open economies, emerging markets, emerging economies might be even more resilient than the large economies and more advanced countries are, and can navigate, in some cases, these global challenges more effectively than others, being more flexible. What this dramatically changed global landscape means to us, to Georgia. For us, it represents a clear challenge because, all our model of development, our prosperity, our macroeconomic stability largely depends on the openness, access to markets, free movement of capital, free movement of goods, and it is a key for us. And of course, when larger countries, larger economies switch to protectionism for whatever reason, the smaller economies like us cannot afford to follow them in this endeavor. And that's why our response is and should be deeper integration, regional integration, at least at the degree that circumstances allows, deeper cooperation within the region, strengthening of regional ties, be it trade, energy, infrastructural projects, central banking, finance. All these areas and ties should be strengthened in this respect in order to address effectively the newly emerged challenge of global fragmentation. And coming back, what are the prerequisites and let's say what could be the successful strategies from our side in this respect? And it was also mentioned by the previous speakers. First of all, I would like to agree that trade is a major driver again, especially now, and that's why it is very important to which degree country is positioned toward these trade routes, the other trade markets, and also I would like to underline the importance of diversification, not only being open and say implement free trade agreements or free trade policy, but also consistent effort to diversify your geographic portfolio, not being dependent on one particular region or one particular country is a key. Especially it's true in terms of energy supply of electric power, natural gas, and other important resources. In this case, let me bring the example of Georgia. I think that we are doing pretty well because this is our norm. This is our usual policy that we started to implement 2 decades ago by widening our free trade agreements network. So Georgia enjoys for many years free trade agreement with the European Union and China, with the all CIS countries and neighborhood, with the Turkey, with the Gulf countries. And so it helps us, of course, to be more resilient. And as it was mentioned correctly here, despite all these global challenges and reconfiguration of the traditional trade linkages and routes, we observe rapidly growing trade volumes within the Middle Corridor, and Georgia is positioned within the Middle Corridor. Just to bring a few more examples, if compared to pre-pandemic level of 2019, our trade bilateral trade with Armenia, with Azerbaijan, our immediate neighbors, increased by 22%. Our trade with the European Union for the same period of times increased by 65%. With China, 80%. And the most striking example is a trade between Georgia and Kazakhstan, which has expanded 8 times, 800% for the same period of 6 years, since 2019. Another important, I think, precondition also, how countries position toward logistic roads. If we can, let's say, somehow distinguish logistic from trade, sometimes it happens like that because, you know, it's a very important driver of, in a modern circumstances. Georgia is historically situated in the middle corridor, the historical Silk Road, and our natural role is to bridge East and West and to play important, let's say, connectivity role between Asia and Europe. But frankly speaking, before recent geopolitical tensions, especially war between Russia and Ukraine, this middle corridor road was seen as a kind of backup, secondary, compared to more efficient and cheaper northern roads, for example, and etc. Now what we observe, this is a growing flow of trade and goods and freight through middle corridor. And it's absolutely understandable because, you know, business looking for safer, more efficient new roads, for more diversification, and even all geopolitical conflicts hopefully would be solved one day. Still, the lessons learned from that would be just to maintain this middle corridor is one of the important roads. And of course, the country should be ready and well prepared. In Georgia, we were investing heavily in transport infrastructure, also in the neighboring countries. I'm very glad to see the efforts of international financial institutions that are supporting this kind of regional infrastructure, be it railway, or like track roads, or ports, or Black Sea submarine power cable that will be developed also to build more connections between East and West. Also, this is a win-win situation for European Union and countries of our region, because as Mark mentioned correctly, now we see emerging interest that comes from European Union towards Central Asian countries, from United States towards Central Asian countries, and we are countries in the middle. So these flows cannot bypass us in any way. This is the geography. So that's why I think that it's equally beneficial to all stakeholders of the corridor. And so again, to be prepared for that, it is very important in order to capitalize on that ongoing trends. Last but not least, also I would like to echo what was said regarding improved resilience and policy frameworks of the emerging markets. And I think that this is something which helps us, and now I'm speaking from the position of regulator in Georgia, because, you know, first of all, just to mention a few features of our frameworks that help us to be more resilient: commitment toward free-floating rate, exchange rate, which helps us to cushion external shocks, commitment to accumulation of gross international reserves in order to create additional buffers, also prudent policy and regulations towards financial sector and supervision, I mean, which force the banks to build more buffers, to be more resilient, to improve quality of their assets, and let's say to decrease level of non-performing loans. All these matters, of course. Last but not least, and probably then we will have opportunity to continue speaking on that topic, in order to use all these opportunities and to increase your resilience, of course, you need to complement the physical connectivity with the financial connectivity. And here we are coming to the challenge that much more to be done in terms of cross-border payments and interoperability and seamless say payments, cross-border payments between the countries in the region, how to approach the innovation and digital. We need some unified approach here because this is something which already happens, and we need to face that, let's say, in order to to use more benefits and to address the challenges in this respect. And also like alignment of policies between central banks, which also puts us in a position of more cooperation between the peer central banks, be it supervision, licensing, AML, data exchange, and many other topics that could be mentioned here. Let me stop here, and so looking forward to hear your views.
Thank you, Governor. Ricardo, if I can now come over to you as the final speaker of the panel. So you have been seeing maybe a type of upbeat sense here, like opportunities, despite the fact that the global economy become more fragmented. But can you tell us if you see any vulnerabilities that you are seeing in part of this world, and also any scope for enhanced regional integration and coordination among the Western Balkans? And as I mentioned at the beginning, you are speaking for yourself. You don't speak for the board of the IMF or as a director of the constituency. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Happy birthday, first of all. And as we say in Italy, 100 of these days, more. It's a great honor to be here, and my task is very arduous because you have a coffee waiting for you, and also because what I'm gonna say has been already discussed somehow in Washington recently. The region is very diversified, and the challenges of the region are different from the specificalities of Albania. Albania, in this sense, is an outlier, in a good sense. So, I'll try to be as brief as I can. What are the challenges of the region? As I said, it doesn't apply to Albania. Low growth, persisting inflation, and public debts going up. Now, what are the recipe for this? Traditional, consolidate where needed, and also continue with the reform process. On the reform process, and also let me add something, protect your institutions. And here I'm happy that the governor is here, because I think that maintaining and preserving the independence of the central bank is a key enabling factor. This is a challenge, it shouldn't be given for granted, and the independence that has been achieved as a cornerstone of stability should continue. The other, on the reforms. Now, I learned today that by doing reform, the entire region face the same challenges. But if they coordinate among them while deciding to do reforms, the results are much effective and also more powerful. I'm referring now, for example, to tips that has been mentioned by Madame Lagarde today. In modernizing a payment system, the region is coordinating among themselves. And that is a success story that should be followed also in other reforms that are necessary to access the EU. So I understand that when policymakers are faced with challenges, they're looking at their own country first. It's normal. But if you can make an effort to also look around you and trying to coordinate, that will certainly serve better. In terms of vulnerability, as I said, labor market, other reforms, labor mobility, electricity has been mentioned, electricity market, and intra-regional barriers. Thanks to some new works of the IMF, what we are realizing as a European, that there are so many obstacles that we're posing ourselves, just not tracking all the barriers that we're putting in our area. That would be something certainly to look for. Has been already mentioned by other colleagues, so I'm not saying anything new. Now, the second, another task that I was assigned by Mark is what the IMF can do to help, and how flexible and country-specific is the current surveillance system and program design. Now, my personal assessment is that the IMF stance towards country specificity is appropriate. Sometimes I would say the tools are so country specific more than you can think about. For example, bilateral surveillance, and here there is the mission chief of the IMF Albanian team here with us. The IMF Article 4 visit is very country-specific, and every mission chief is doing their best for making policy advice more tailor-made. Regional outlook. The regional outlook of the IMF, and Director Kammer is here with us, is every meeting in Washington has a specific focus on the region to identify common challenges. That I think is very appropriate. We have another instrument, is the FSAP, is a deep dive in financial market regulation and functioning to see how the system in each country is adapted to the challenges. And let me add another element, that is the technical assistance. So thanks to the initiative of the IMF, and Director Kammer is here, the IMF is establishing a new center to support the region, and that will be certainly tailor-made to your needs. So there is a lot of work from the IMF side to be more country-specific. And also going forward, we have some reviews of policies, for example, the review of surveillance, country surveillance of program design, and the FSAP that are coming to the board in the next year. And we're trying to draw lessons from what we have learned by doing, and certainly the fact to be more country-specific will be enhanced. I don't know if I answer all your questions, but I try to be brief. And thank you, all of you, for your attention.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think we come to an end, and I think we know we are going to have a coffee break, but specifically another session. So I apologize as I cannot take questions, but if I have to summarize, what was the main takeaway for me for this session, at the end, what we are witnessing here by describing, the current global economy, the transformation, fragmentation, maybe we are heading toward a world of multipolarity. And that's maybe what I came out from the different parts of the world, where we were discussing Europe, the Western Balkans, Central Asia, Caucasus. So maybe a world that is becoming more regionalized, but a world where we are going to see now more multipolarity. So despite the US-China confrontation, countries around the world are adapting themselves. So we cannot see that only from a negative point of view, but there may be scope of opportunities where we are going to think about global governance, global economy, which would mean maybe for the Bretton Woods institutions, for the IMF and the World Bank, maybe time to adapt for this new multipolarity. In any case, please.
Sorry, I forgot to mention that one of the main opportunity, I think, is joining EU. It has been echoed by everyone, but I think that is also a very anchor for reforms, because what Albania is doing on adapting, it's outstanding. Sorry, I forgot to.
No problem. Very good. So thank you, all the speakers, panelists. A warm applause for them. We go for a quick coffee break, and we will return for the next sessions that the governor will be sharing. Thanks.